PhD in history?
In history.
Okay, great.
University of Scranton, that looks,
With the Jesuits.
yeah.
Any direction? Good evening, everyone. Good to be with you, and thanks for joining our live stream here via Lourdes Live for our third St. Anthony session on justice. This is a new series that seeks to apply the wisdom of various disciplines including Catholic teaching and Catholic social teaching, history, as we'll see this evening, to contemporary issues in society, issues of justice. In September, we examined the topic of spiritual and psychological resilience in this challenging time of COVID and social unrest. Dr. Chris Stravich from Houston, a psychologist in Houston, was with us, and he talked about psychological resilience, and I spoke on spiritual resilience. And the key there was to make sure that we're doing the work of a healthy soul, a well-ordered soul. Pope Benedict has spoken about justice comes from just people, and it's a heart and a soul that's rightly ordered to God and neighbor, but making sure that we're also healthy, living healthy lives in a time of challenge. Last month, just a couple of weeks ago, we had a fantastic panel of 4 members of the Lourdes family, 2 of whom are here tonight. People of color from different backgrounds sharing their stories, their wisdom, their faith, and their perspective. It was one of the most enlightening programs that I've ever been a part of as a priest. I was very humbled as pastor that all of these folks are part of our community here at Our Lady of Lourdes. And so I thank them for their great panel a couple of weeks ago. And it really goes to what is important in terms of Catholic social teaching, that experience is a source of truth. So we have scripture, we have tradition, we have natural law, and we have experience. And we refer to that as the epistemology of experience. We learn what is true through the experience, including journeying with others in their experience. Tonight we're really honored to have Dr. Yohuru Williams, who I will introduce in a minute, and he is going to speak on the critical topic of racial justice in American historical context. He may have a more specific title and may correct me on that. I heard Dr. Williams give a version of this talk in late August. Professor Hank Shea and I teach an intensive course in restorative justice, and Dr. Williams gave this talk to our law students. It was the highlight of the week. It was extraordinary, and really thank him for his generosity of spirit being here tonight. It was very enlightening, it was challenging, it was exhortative, and it was rooted in history, rooted in reality and truth. Now, a bit about the social context that we're in now, in which this talk takes place. This continues to be a fraught time. We have an election that is disputed by the president and some of his supporters and those who voted for him. COVID is raging throughout the country, including here in Minnesota. We set new records just about every day. It is a very challenging time. Pressing issues of justice remain. They remain critical and relevant in our nation across so many categories. In the Catholic context, we had the release yesterday of the McCarrick Report, which was very challenging for Catholics to read. I commend the Church. I commend Pope Francis and other church officials. It was an exhaustive report, 460 pages, but what it shows is there's much work yet to be done in the Catholic Church. And when we talk about issues of justice from a Catholic perspective, we must make sure that we're doing everything with regard to those, including those who have been victims of clergy abuse, to make sure that we have a safe environment and justice within our communion. Like last time, we're going to give you a number that you can text questions to, and that number is 763-645-4146, 763-645-4146, and these will be questions for Dr. Williams. We should have 15 minutes or so at the end, and I'll be giving him the questions as they come in tonight. That's not my cell phone, by the way. But the questions will be forwarded to me. So very honored to have Dr. Yohuru Williams with us today. Dr. Williams is a distinguished university chair, professor and the founding director of the Racial Justice Initiative at the University of St. Thomas, a noted scholar of the civil rights civil rights and black power movements, an education activist and frequent national commentator. He is an important voice on the topic of race and social justice. He is a colleague of mine not only at St. Thomas but on the law school faculty as well. He holds both an appointment on the law school faculty and also the faculty, the history faculty, but holds a university-wide chair. I would say this, there's a lot of talented folks at the University of St. Thomas, and we're fortunate to have those folks as colleagues. On the top of everyone's list at the university is Dr. Williams. He blends an extraordinary intellect with a fantastic education, passion, a thoughtful approach to issues that is so critical in our day. He also, for a number of years, was the dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, where he was very, very well respected in that work as well. So we're honored to have Dr. Williams with us. We thank him for his time this evening and taking us through a very important historical lesson in American history and racial justice. Dr. Williams, welcome to Our Lady of Lourdes.
Thank you, Father. Thank you for having me. I'm not going to change much of what I proposed that I would talk about with the community tonight, but I did change the title a little bit to The Substance of Things Hoped For, American History and Racial Justice. Because I think when Father says we're in extraordinary times right now, it's important for us to recognize that even in the context of the anxiety that people are feeling about this moment, there are a lot of things that we can take comfort in. The reality that this past summer, one of my mentors, John Lewis, passed, and shortly before he passed, he wrote a letter to the American people, to Black Lives Matter activists specifically, but to the American people in general. And what John Lewis did in that letter is remind all of us that freedom is a constant struggle. But at the core, it's also a struggle of spirit and of faith. Because ultimately, we have to believe, like Cardinal Newman did, that at the end of the day, we can't suppose that the work of those that have gone before us has been in vain, that there's an ever-present evolution that we work through as we work toward justice. And the reason I like this sign is that people often ask the question, where are communities of faith in this conversation? We see ministers like Al Sharpton, but we don't necessarily see imams, and we don't necessarily see priests, we don't necessarily see the church. Well, the church is there. And this protest I thought was really powerful because this nun had a sign which read, "Racism is," I love that, just want to break it down, it's something that we live with. It is a reality in American society and culture. But she goes on and says, a social and a spiritual disease. And we have to recognize in some important way that, as Dr. King and others argued in the 1960s, this isn't just about rooting out structural inequality. That's important. Absolute equality before the law from a legal standpoint is essential. But it's also about redeeming the soul of America. That ultimately there's something greater to be lost here. And that is not only our shared humanity, but our opportunity to live in the image of our Creator and to create a just world, to ultimately aspire to something much greater than any of us can conceive of. But the possibility is there. And I think what's interesting about this is that she concluded it by saying that it's a social and spiritual disease that kills people, not just the people who are victims of violence or injustice or poverty, but also the people who are indifferent to the suffering of others. And that spiritual death is perhaps more profound. I love that because, in a way, when we think about this from this standpoint, this summer I was invited by my good friend Pat Exner to talk to Catholic school teachers here in the Twin Cities. And this was the mission statement that Pat put together for educators. And the question, or the essential question for the educators, was simply this: how do we build a spirit and practice of mindfulness encircling justice and anti-racism work to become stronger allies? And I love that because he was talking to and thinking that we needed to address that work specifically to teachers, but the reality is we need to address that to our entire community. What does allyship mean? And then how do we recalibrate in this moment to think about how we show up as stronger allies in the difficult work of dismantling systemic racism and injustice? And we do that for the communities, and I love this language, that we serve. Because ultimately, as we know from Scripture, the greatest among us is he or she who serves, who recognizes that obligation to service. Second part of this I thought was interesting, though, is that Pat said, look, how does this become part of our faith journey and our daily walk? Because the reality is we can no longer afford as a society and a culture to be shocked to the quick every time the next incident of police brutality happens and then assume, and it's not just police brutality, every time we learn about the unprecedented amount of poverty that impacts this country. Every time we think about the amount of discrimination and segregation that impact every segment of American society and culture, every time we think about educational inequality, we can't constantly be surprised to the point that we say, what are we going to do? We have to make this part of our daily walk as well. We have to make this part of our consciousness. Having said that, I want to begin with some conventional wisdom from James Baldwin, who said, the world changes according to the way people see it. And if you can alter even by a millimeter the way people look at reality, then you can change it. One of the most powerful things about history is that sometimes in looking at the past, if we're careful, we can alter the way that we're thinking about the present. We can understand in the context of what has gone before, where we have been successful and ultimately where we failed. What we didn't appreciate in moments where we had tremendous opportunity and we squandered that opportunity either through hubris or simply through ignorance. And I want to talk about both of those tonight because they're a core part of this conversation. At the same time, I also want to be clear that there may be very little that I share with you tonight that's new. But I hope that in the process of having this conversation, I can alter at least slightly the way that we're thinking about this historical moment. Having said that, I like to begin with talking about Catholic schools and my work with Ascension and JP2 and St. Peter Claver tonight, because that's where my roots are. I'm a product of Catholic education. I went to a Jesuit Jesuit high school and a Jesuit university. No one has been more steeped in Catholic social teaching or more familiar with the work of the church than I. And no one recognizes in a more direct way in this moment how Catholic social teaching in a very powerful way speaks to the challenges of this moment. And thinking about the ways that we can use that to address the same. But the reason I love this image is I was in New York City, this is going back to 2012, and I was talking to a group of young people at a Catholic school, and we were talking about Jackie Robinson, and this young girl there, who's sitting there, I can't remember her name, asked a question about how Jackie Robinson felt. And I had a hard time answering that question in that moment because I was prepared for students to ask me what Jackie Robinson's batting average was. And did Jackie ever win a World Series? And was Jackie Robinson ever angry? So those were the standard questions. But this young girl in that moment communicated something that I think that's important for all of us to remember about where we are now and the young people who are watching what's happening in the United States who have substantive questions about what commitment we're making in this moment to address racism and racial injustice. How did Jackie feel? But how do young people feel looking at a nation which is politically polarized, unable really to face this long history of racial inequality in substantive ways, afraid of the conversation, not just the action, but the conversation itself. And what does that mean for us when we think about the long shadow of George Floyd? And when I say the long shadow, I mean that because in a way, race in the United States has always been, to a certain extent, a conversation about the invisibility of the most vulnerable and marginalized among us. And I love Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, which was published in 1952, because in that book, Ralph Ellison, without meaning to do so, actually gave us a powerful tool for understanding our contemporary moment. A lot of people ask me, where does Black Lives Matter come from? Why do those t-shirts say stay woke? Where's that language come from? Well, if you read Ellison's book, in the beginning he has this wonderful meditation from the main character who's nameless for the entire novel, and that's intentional on Ellison's part. Right? Because in some sense, the main character, although he's the center of the story, is invisible. In the same way, in this country, although race is hyper-visible, although we can talk about educational inequality, housing inequality, and all types of trauma visited on communities of color, specifically the African-American community, they're invisible. And what Ellison wrote was this: I'm invisible, understand, simply because people refuse to see me. Like the bodiless heads you see sometimes in circus sideshows, it's as though I've been surrounded by mirrors of hard, distorting glass. When they approach me, they see only my surroundings, themselves, or figments of their imagination. Indeed, everything and anything except me. What's so powerful about that for me is that when I see that video of George Floyd and Officer Chauvin with his knee on George Floyd's neck, it immediately, for me, brought back this passage, because I can imagine the myriad ways in which when people encounter African Americans, when people encounter indigenous people, when people encounter people of color, that's the experience that people of color sometimes have in relation to how they're treated in those encounters. They see only my surroundings, Minneapolis, St. Paul, bad neighborhood, minority neighborhood, community of color, high poverty, 98% free and reduced lunch, whatever metric you want to institute in there, that becomes a stand-in for the human beings that live in that community. Themselves, how do I feel in relation to my encounter with this person, right? These are the things that I've heard about these communities, and so therefore I'm going to respond accordingly, because that's what I see on television, and that's what I see in movies, and that's what I've been socialized to believe. Not a question, as Father mentioned in the very beginning, of intimate experience, not the hard work of breaking down barriers and saying, in this moment I have a chance to truly be human and to reach out and connect with another individual, but simply to retreat to stereotypes and engage based on the same. And then last but not least, figments of their imagination, what they perceive as opposed to what is reality. And the danger that's created in those moments when we have to deconstruct, and in a way, we all got that opportunity in May and watching that in that video. Ellison concludes this passage, I remember that I'm invisible and I walk softly so as not to awake the sleeping ones. Sometimes it's best not to awaken them. There are few things in the world as dangerous as sleepwalkers. I want to talk about this for a minute, because I think Officer Chauvin, sleepwalking, not to recognize the fear, the pain, the trauma, which we all could see very clearly in that video, but which in that moment escaped him. And yet, I'll be very honest about all of us, probably escapes us on a daily basis in the way that we engage with and think about contemporary issues of race and class and injustice that we are numb to. In fact, I'll go one step further. There's a reason those shirts say "Stay Woke," because this generation of activists associated with Black Lives Matter say, we're no longer interested in not waking up the sleepwalkers. Sleepwalking kills. Racism kills. Silently. And we deceive ourselves into believing that we've made substantive progress when in fact what we're doing is putting a Band-Aid on problems. And they're saying, stay woke, wake it up. Let's make this an issue. Let's conquer this and deal with this issue once and for all. And as destabilizing as that mantra may be to some people, it's powerful when we can put that in conversation with the thoughts of other African Americans, prominent and otherwise. Take LeBron James, perhaps the most famous and one of the wealthiest African Americans in the world today, a celebrated athlete. But in 2017, before there was this big controversy over kneeling in the NFL, which was appropriate when you had athletes like Colin Kaepernick and others saying, we take this stance because we don't know any other way than to wake the nation up to what's happening. If we use this platform that we have in a very visible way, when we come into people's living rooms on Sunday, when we have a captive audience with regard to our national fascination with sports, and people tune in and we're taking a knee, maybe they'll wake up. But it was LeBron James in 2017 who, in the midst of a run at the NBA Finals, commented, and even though it's concealed most of the time, we know people hide their faces and will say things when they see that smile on your face. Racism, is alive every single day. I think back to Emmett Till's mom, actually. I want to say something that was in that first slide that I didn't get a chance to talk about, but I want to spend just 2 seconds talking about with you right now. Wounds produce narratives. And when we don't address the wound, that narrative manifests itself in the lives of people, in some sense like a cancer. It eats away at their sense of security. It eats away at their sense of self. It eats away at their sense of belonging. Now, we can't afford that in a church any more than we could afford that in our larger society and culture. When we cultivate that and we don't address it, it produces despair. And despair robs people of their ability to show up as their authentic selves and not only engage in our participatory democracy, and we need that, but also in our communities. I want to be clear then, because what Lebron does here is, in talking about Emmett Till, invokes this history where LeBron James was not alive when Emmett Till was killed in Money, Mississippi in 1955. But the wound remains. And what LeBron was doing in that moment, and I'll talk about historical recovery in just a second, is reminding all of us that the invisible for many in some communities are ever present because of the wound, and how as easy as LeBron was able to talk about with facility Emmett Till. In a documentary I did a few years ago on lynching, I told the interviewers, my parents grew up in the shadow of Emmett Till. I grew up in the shadow of Yusef Hawkins. My son will grow up in the shadow of James Byrd, and my daughters grew up in the shadow of Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, Jamar Clark, Ahmaud Arbery, Raynette Turner, Breonna Taylor. When do we stop the shadows? LeBron goes one step further and he says, that's why Emmett Till's mom wanted an open casket, because she wanted the world to know what her son went through as far as a hate crime and being black in America. She wanted the world to see. She wanted that pain to be visible. She wanted people to recognize and acknowledge Emmett Till's humanity. She wanted the nation to recognize the stain of racism and the debilitating impact that it has, not only on our democracy, but on individuals, on human beings, on their very soul. And when we can watch or see something like that and it doesn't move us to action, what does it say about our own sense of shared humanity? I want to go one step further here, because LeBron concludes very similar to the way that Michelle Obama did in 2008. She got in a lot of hot water for saying, after her husband was elected president, it was the first time in her adult life she had been proud of being an American. And people said, how could you say that? And I said, I understand that exactly, because Michelle is really audibilizing the wound. The things that we don't think are possible, because we're constantly reminded of the injustice. LeBron concludes, no matter how much money you have, no matter how famous you are, no matter how many people admire you, being black in America is tough. We've got a long way to go for us as a society and for us as African Americans until we feel free and equal. He said that in 2017. 3 years later, we all watched the video of George Floyd, and suddenly the world seemed to wake up to the reality of this problem. And I think part of what Father and I want to communicate today is that we can't let this be one of those singular moments in our history where people wake up and then over the course of time find a way to go back to sleep on this issue, to convince themselves that we've made progress based on some cosmetic changes, but nothing that's deeper than that. And I say that to you because if we think about this from a historical standpoint, I gave you two examples of individuals in terms of Michelle Obama and LeBron James, but I also want to talk about how wounds produce narratives in the lives of people like Malcolm X. If you read the autobiography of Malcolm X, remember what Malcolm says is that moment that radicalizes him. It is this encounter he has with a school teacher in Lansing, Michigan, where he's at the top of his class. And in this moment where he goes to the teacher for advice, and the teacher tells him, be realistic about what your expectations are as a black person in America. That Malcolm X, the fearsome black power leader that everyone continues to talk about as this feared, was born in that moment of imposed despair. What does Malcolm write in the autobiography? What I'm trying to say is that it just never dawned upon them that I could understand that I wasn't a pet, but a human being. They didn't give me credit for having the same sensitivity, intellect, and understanding that they would have been ready and willing to recognize in a white boy in my position. But it's historically been the case with white people in their regard for black people that even though we might be with them, we weren't considered of them. Even though they appeared to have opened the door, it was still closed. Thus, they never really did see me. Now, if I had more time tonight, I could go through this theme of invisibility with you in various manifestations in other cartoons and in other documents and in other pieces of literature by African-American authors. But I also think that I can encapsulate this by virtue of a political cartoon that was produced in 2014 after the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Now, I went to Ferguson, Missouri, Ferguson Florissant, with the National Alliance for Faith and Justice. And we were there where in Ferguson Florissant, that school district is 98% free and reduced lunch. There is no better indicator of poverty than the amount of free and reduced lunch in any community. So we're talking about very, very poor community. And when we were there, I remember a few months later, this cartoon came out from David Fitzsimmons. And it shows a young boy sitting on Santa Claus's lap. I love this. And the young boy, who's clearly suffering from poverty from the way that he's dressed, is talking to Santa, and Santa asks him, "What would you like?" And the young boy says, "I'd like a safe neighborhood, a good education, and white privilege." The first two we can understand. The last one's interesting because why should white privilege be the key to anyone having a safe neighborhood and a good education? It's not only undemocratic, it's fundamentally unchristian. Santa's response to him, which you can't see, it's cut off a little bit here, is "this century?" ? And that resonated with me when I heard Al Sharpton deliver the eulogy here for George Floyd in Minneapolis, when he said George Floyd's story has been the story of black people. For 400 years, this has been the response. Freedom now? Dealing with inequality now? Let's put it off. We can talk about this historically in a number of ways. We can talk about the compromise during the Constitutional Convention that resulted in the protection of slavery in the Constitution, not by name, but that virtually guaranteed its existence. We could talk about this in the aftermath of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the Hayes-Tilden Compromise of 1877, which ultimately will result in the sacrificing of Reconstruction in the South, this effort to reform the South, on the altar of electing a Republican president in Rutherford B. Hayes. We can talk about this in 1950s, 1954, 1955 with the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education, where, remember, and we know this because many of us lived through it, the United States Supreme Court says that schools should desegregate, quote, with all deliberate speed. And I stand before you in 2020 in a community where, in Minnesota, we lag behind every state in the union in educational outcomes for African American students, last behind Mississippi. Where's the all deliberate speed in that? This century indeed. What the history should do is compel us to think about what it means to take action. I have a lot of people ask me, what should we do? What should I read? What should I do? I love this from this great book by these authors where they kind of talk about three core tensions in this desire to take action. And those core tensions are, what can I do that's personal? What can I do that's structural? And what can I do that really results or it connects with strategies? And I think that's important because in a way, Catholic social teaching provides us the blueprint to think about that in a very concrete way that often goes overlooked because we're not privileging Catholic social teaching in our conversations about the dismantling of historic racism and racial injustice in the United States, and we should be. This is a space in which we can lead because, as Father pointed out from the very beginning, whether we're looking at this from Scripture, or whether we're looking at it from the standpoint of experience, whether we're talking about it in conversation, I love reminding people, as John Lewis did often, that when John Lewis, who was training to be a Baptist minister, was on his way to Selma to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge, he had two things in his backpack: a toothbrush, because civil rights activists always assumed they were going to go to jail. And so that was an essential tool that you needed if you were going to go to jail. He also had a copy of a book by Thomas Merton. The reason that's important is if we think about these pillars, dignity of the human person, solidarity, care for God's creation, a call to family, community participation, our option for the poor and the vulnerable, rights and responsibilities, dignity of work and rights of workers. They resonate so powerful in every chapter of our history where you have people contending for justice, and when that justice is denied, it not only mocks our core democratic values, those things that we locate in the Declaration of Independence and the preamble, we the people in order to form a perfect union, but also the core tenets of Catholic social teaching. In fact, one of the people to speak on this without invoking Catholic social teaching was the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. In 1967, Dr. King is invited by the American Psychological Association to give an address at their annual conference. And King has a very interesting message for the psychologists there around what he called creative maladjustment. And I want to share this with you because it's powerful. Of course, it wasn't published until 1968, but he gave this address in September of 67. He said, "You who are in the field of psychology have given us a great word, and that word is maladjusted. It is the word maladjusted. The word is probably used more than any other word in psychology. It's a good word, which is ironic because we tend to think of maladjusted as bad. If you're maladjusted, psychology says, here's what we have to do to adjust and help you recalibrate in order to be able to function in society. But King said, no, it's a good word. Certainly, it's good in that it's dealing with what the word implies. You're declaring that destructive maladjustment should be destroyed. You're saying that we must seek the well-adjusted life in order to avoid neurotic and schizophrenic personalities." But watch where King goes next. "But on the other hand, I'm sure that you will recognize that there are some things in our society, some things in our world, to which we should never be adjusted. There are some things concerning which we must always be maladjusted if we're to be people of goodwill." This is a moment in the United States where we need creative maladjustment around racial injustice. In fact, King is going to go one step further, and I love this. We must never adjust ourselves to racial discrimination and racial segregation. We must never adjust ourselves to religious bigotry. We must never adjust ourselves to economic conditions that take necessities from the many and give luxuries to the few. We must never adjust ourselves to the madness of militarism and the self-defeating effects of physical violence. Did King not just call 2020 and what we witnessed in May? More importantly, does King not resonate in a very powerful way with the core tenets of Catholic social teaching? Are they not in conversation in a way that when we're thinking about what can we do and how do we take action and what's a blueprint for us going forward, we have it? Ibram Kendi is a very good friend of mine, a colleague. I blurbed his first book, Stamped from the Beginning. Everyone's reading his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and I can boil the book down to one phrase for you. Kendi says, if you want to be an anti-racist, take action. But I want to be clear. Do not Martin Luther King and Catholic social teaching also compel us to take action in very clear and tangible ways about what needs to be done so we can be creatively maladjusted so that when we are looking at a condition where Minnesota's dead last in educational outcomes, can we rally around that and think about what we can do to create opportunity and to address that inequality? More importantly, I want to go to something that King wrote in his book, Strength to Love, where he said, look, we have to be also honest with ourselves that sincerity and conscientiousness in themselves are not enough. History, he wrote, has proven that these noble virtues may degenerate into tragic vices. Nothing in the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. Devoid of intelligence, goodness, and conscientiousness will become brutal forces for leading to shameful crucifixions. Never must the church tire of reminding men they have a moral responsibility to be intelligent. They have a moral and ethical responsibility to privilege our shared humanity. They have a moral responsibility to think concretely about how to elevate rather than to denigrate our fellow human beings. I don't want to lose you here, but I want to be clear. The shadows of this moment in the context of this conversation between King and Catholic social teaching and LeBron James and Ralph Ellison and a nun who has a sign that encapsulates all of it, and racism is a social and spiritual disease which kills people. I shouldn't be able to do that. They shouldn't resonate. They shouldn't echo if it isn't clear what the blueprint is for us in terms of thinking about what dismantling looks like and what our responsibility in it is. In fact, when I think about this, in all of these areas, whether we're talking about police brutality, whether we're talking about racial injustice, whether we're talking about COVID-19, it's a shame that in all things that we struggle with in our nation, it has a shade. Think about the outcomes for people of color who suffering from COVID-19 and the disproportionate mortality rate that we associate with people in communities of color struck by COVID-19. Think about the fact that George Floyd had COVID-19. I mean, these are the type of questions that we have to have that transcend, and it's really bottom then on us really being able to appreciate what I like to call historical recovery. I want to run through this very quickly, but I want to be clear. One of the things that struck me in the immediate aftermath of the murder of George Floyd was the fact that 2 weeks after Mr. Floyd was killed, the nation paused to commemorate 3 anniversaries, which very few people knew anything about. The first was Juneteenth. So I can't tell you the number of people that came to me and said, I never heard of Juneteenth before. The second is specific to here in Minnesota, and that was the Duluth lynching of 1920. And then the third was the Tulsa race riot of 1921. Now there's a thread of consistency running through all of these moments in our history which speak powerfully to what happened here in May. But if you don't know that history, then it's impossible to make those connections. Let me just share them with you very quickly. In Juneteenth, as many of you know, the reason we celebrated or commemorated is that's the day that Texas slaves found out, the enslaved in Texas found out, they actually had been emancipated because there was an effort to deprive them of that knowledge and to keep them in a position of subservience and slavery, to keep them enslaved. That's a fundamental injustice we're talking about. In the Tulsa race riot of 1921, just to give you a very, very quick history of this, it involved a young man by the name of Dick Rowland, who was falsely accused of assaulting a young white girl. He bumped into her in an elevator. The girl later repudiated that anything had happened. Nevertheless, Dick Rowland was taken to the police station for safekeeping. Because there were so many lynchings in America at that time, double-digit lynchings every year in nearly every state of the union. In fact, the NAACP used to do a report card where they would call out the states where there had been no lynchings. And it was only in the Northeast that you had this, Connecticut and New Jersey and New York and Massachusetts where you had no record. But just about every state of the union, you had these episodes of racial violence. The African Americans in Tulsa go to the jail armed to offer to the sheriff their services to protect Dick Rowland's life, to make sure he gets a fair trial. The sheriff, when these armed African Americans show up, immediately disarms them. And when a white armed mob shows up later on, not only does the sheriff not disarm them, but in not turning Dick Rowland over to them, angers them to the extent that they turn their anger, frustration, and violence on the African American community, burning a prosperous black community to the ground and killing untold numbers of people died in Tulsa. Official estimates are around 300. Most historians assume it's much higher. We'll never know. Now, how does that connect to Duluth? In 1920 in Duluth, 3 African American circus workers are lynched after a young couple stays out past curfew. They don't want to admit that they've stayed out after curfew, so they concoct a story about the girl being sexually assaulted. The police chief in Duluth made this statement because he knew the mob was coming, that he would not risk, quote, 1 drop of Anglo-Saxon blood in defense of the lives of the Negro prisoners, end quote. When we talk about wounds producing narratives, when we talk about the long shadow of this moment, when people were thinking about what happened to George Floyd, they were thinking about it in the context of all this other history and all these other chapters, and how one simple phrase, Black Lives Matter, applies in literally every one of those episodes. And it begs the question, at what point do we get to a point in our society and culture we no longer have to sloganize what should be obvious and what's baked into, again, our founding documents and what we profess in our houses of worship, but which never seem to translate to the most vulnerable in our communities. Look, I don't want to lose you, but I want to be clear. When I think about that moment, what I saw in the reaction to George Floyd was not this sense of Minnesota exceptionalism. It wasn't just thinking about Jamar Clark and Philando Castile. It was this national wound. In fact, global, because we saw the response in countries all over the world where indigenous people, as in Australia, pointed to their own struggles with systemic racism and injustice and racial injustice there. When I say wounds produce narratives, I want to give you a good example of this. We run the risk in not talking about historical recovery and focusing so narrowly on the contemporary and not understanding how deep those wounds run. People like to talk about Colin Kaepernick, but the reality is, think about Mexico City in 1968, when Juan Carlos and Tommy Smith, after having won the gold and silver, took to the podium and delivered an address. People were so upset for them for doing this. Why did you spoil the Olympics? And they argued, this was the biggest stage, and we knew that we would be seen if we seized this moment. And if I share with you what they did as part of that protest, I think you'll find this mind-blowing. They had black sock feet without shoes to highlight black poverty. These are not new issues. They had beads to symbolize lynchings. So we're not talking about lynching today. A lot of people tried to make the comparison between lynching and what happened to George Floyd. They're different. I think we have to recognize the differences in the types of violence. But the reality is it's still official misconduct or someone not, and we don't know what's going to be the outcome of that case, being punished or seemingly not punished for the killing of another individual. And then last but not least, black gloved fists to represent their solidarity and support with black people and oppressed people. See, the assumption is always that this was about black power, and at the core it was a reflection of black power, but they were also trying to express kinship on that international stage with all people, the Dalit in India, and other oppressed people who were suffering from similar systems of injustice imposed to deny people their fundamental humanity, regardless of the politics that define the nations in which they lived. When we think about this in the context of our history, I like to remind people that in 1960, we had a National Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence. This is before the mass shootings and foolishness that we're experiencing now. We had a chance in 1960 to deal with it. We had an opportunity. We always have these opportunities. We always get these second springs. We squander them. So what does the National Commission on Causes and Prevention of Violence say in 1960? I love this, but I don't love it because it worries me, and yet it inspires me because I do think that we're in a moment of transformation. They say our most serious challenges to date have been external. World War I, Pearl Harbor. This kind of strong and resourceful country could unite against an external enemy. While serious external dangers remain, the graver threats today are internal. See, I don't want to be political, but sometimes it's important for us to just address things that require our attention as human beings and as citizens. We were all concerned about Russian interference in our election and what foreign actors were doing, but we weren't talking about how deeply divided we were as a nation. And that's the work that needs to be done in order to create and repair pathways to community rebuilding and healing. We have to talk about that. In fact, this is 1960 again, and when you do historical recovery, the powerful thing is I don't have to talk about the contemporary and have people retreat to their red and blue corners. I can say, what happened in this moment that failed, that we didn't appreciate, the enormous opportunity we had then to deal with? Listen to the shopping list here. Haphazard urbanization. You mean like the destruction of the Rondo community? Racial discrimination. Disfiguring the environment. I have young people today that think that Greta is the first person that talked about environmentalism, and yet the reality is we know in a world now where science deniers predominate, we can talk about Rachel Carson and Silent Spring in this moment. We can talk about this being on the national spotlight in terms of how we dealt with issues of the environment. Unprecedented interdependence, the dislocation of human identity and motivation created by an affluent society, all resulting in a rising tide of individual and group violence. They called Columbine before Columbine, Aurora before Aurora, Kenosha before Kenosha. What's really powerful then about thinking about this is that it makes it much larger than the small percentage of racism that we catch on cell phones. It's not just about bird watchers in New York City who catch people saying, I'm gonna call the cops on you, and recognizing in that moment that he literally, when she did that, put him in danger, because if the police had come and acted in the way that we have become accustomed through video of seeing certain officers react, we don't want to paint with broad brushes. The reality is that she put him in mortal danger by virtue of saying, I'm being attacked, come quick. But that's the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we're talking about. I said to you in the beginning, the world changes according to the way people see it. That image of George Floyd to me when he's getting out of the car is, I'm seeing that history in his eyes, the fear of that wound, that encounter, which communities of color know intimately. I say that because when Al Sharpton used that metaphor, the knee, 400 years you had our knee on your knee on our neck. The knee in our history has been the period from 1619 to 1865 of chattel slavery. That was a knee. It was an oppressive system co-signed by our political and religious institutions that allowed for the enslavement of human beings. And in spite of the paradox, no one seemed committed to dealing with the issue except for a small, dedicated minority of abolitionists. Then we had this tremendous moment of opportunity during Reconstruction, where between 1865 and 1877, as I mentioned earlier, you're going to have no less than 7 major pieces of legislation aimed at ensuring absolute equality before the law for people of color, for African Americans in the United States. A 13th Amendment which abolishes slavery, a 14th Amendment which confers citizenship, a 15th Amendment which says there should be no discrimination in voting based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude, a Civil Rights Act of 1866, a Civil Rights Act of 1875, an Enforcement Act of 1870, a Ku Klux Klan, and in spite of all that legislation, by 1877, in a 10-year window, it's all gone. We then have the period that we know very well, the age of Jim Crow segregation, where we could recognize the wound by virtue of those white and colored signs that peppered every state of the Union, right? And even where there was no formal segregation, if you watch phenomenal documentaries like the Jim Crow of the North, you know how they impacted Minnesota in terms of housing and education, so on and so forth. So we know how insidious both de facto, by custom, and de jure, by law, segregation was. And then last but not least, in this period that we're living in now, it's the maintenance and persistence of systemic structural anti-Black racism in the United States that we need to address. And we need to understand this, and again, I am not being political in saying this, but I want to be clear about something that I say when I give talks and I don't do trainings. Because history is not, the knowledge that we learn from interrogating our history is not about how to be an anti-racist, it's about how to recognize injustice. Now, I want to be clear, I don't know if Adam Zeigler, who works for the Buffalo News, knows about this cartoon from Herb Block. But Herb Block was one of the most celebrated political cartoonists of the 1950s and 1960s. Kind of ubiquitous in terms of political art from that period, political cartoons. And in 1956, he produced this cartoon that shows Uncle Sam talking to Dwight David Eisenhower, who Herb Block imagined as the fire chief. He's looking out the window at the nation in flames over civil rights. What were the issues in 1956? Little Rock. Brown versus Board of Education, authoring Lucy. Think about all the things that were happening in that moment. And Eisenhower saying to Uncle Sam, tisk, tisk, somebody should do something about that. And you can almost imagine Uncle Sam saying back to Eisenhower, but you're the president. In 2020, Adam Zeigler, who I absolutely love, had this illustration in the Buffalo News of our current president with his knee on the fire hose. And what I'm saying to you is that it's not that history repeats itself, it's that it echoes. And the power of those echoes are such that when we can make this kind of comparison and ask the question why we're still asking so many years later, more than 50 years later, why we continually don't seem to be able to move the needle or appreciate Black lives and the damage this does to our democracy and our society as a whole, how it robs us of our very humanity. Look, we're not going to define progress in terms of the cosmetic. It's not just about taking down statues or hashtagging on social media. It's got to look at all the manifestations of inequality that plague our society and culture. And when I talk about historical recovery, I want to be clear in sharing this with you that we talk about the Black Lives Matter movement. I like to talk about Black Lives Matter moments. This is the Niagara Movement Declaration of Sentiments from 1905. So this is more than 100, I want you to think about this, more than 100 years ago. So in 1905, this all-black organization, which was a precursor to the NAACP, had a Declaration of Sentiments. I'm only going to read 3 of them for you, but I think they'll resonate with you in terms of making the connections that I've been trying to make between our history and what we haven't learned and what we need to do moving forward. First and foremost, they said, courts. We demand upright judges in courts, juries selected without discrimination on account of color, and the same measure of punishment and the same efforts at reformation for black as for white offenders. Why are we still talking about that in 2020? Why does Michelle Alexander have a national bestseller in The New Jim Crow? Why does Ta-Nehisi Coates have a national bestseller in Between the World and Me? Why does Ibram Kendi have a national bestseller in Stamped from the Beginning, and then How to Be an Anti-Racist, when in fact the Niagara movement was talking about that in 1905, before the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Look at where they go next. We need orphanages and farm schools for dependent children, juvenile reformatories for delinquents, and the abolition of the dehumanizing convict lease system. People will not recognize this, but really what they were talking about would have been the equivalent in their day of defund the police, which destabilizes people because people read that as simply get rid of police, when they're saying, nope, reallocate some of the funding to go to deal with areas where there are other harmful things that are happening in communities that might elevate those communities and reduce crime by extension. Look at public opinion. This is going to weird you out. I gave this presentation last week in the aftermath of the election. We note with alarm the evident retrogression in this land of sound public opinion on the subject of manhood rights, Republican government, and human brotherhood. In other words, the machinery of government. And we pray, God, that this nation will not degenerate into a mob of boasters and oppressors. 1905. Rather, we hope that the nation will return to the faith of the fathers, that all men are created free and equal with certain unalienable rights. Last but not least, health. We plead for health, for an opportunity to live in decent houses and localities, for a chance to rear our children in physical and moral cleanliness. Again, I want to mention, think about the cartoon I showed you from 2014. I should not be able to do this across time if we have to constantly come back and ask, what are the issues again and what do we need to deal with? We think about it in that sense, and then we connect that to that creative maladjustment and to that Catholic social teaching. Then we recognize that this is bigger than the franchise. In fact, we can see that not simply in the historical experience of the fact that we elected an African-American president and now a African-American vice president. The reality is Dr. King would have said, any of the civil rights leaders would have told you that the civil rights movement was never about electing a black president or a black vice president. It was about dealing with the deeper structural inequalities that plague African Americans in the society and by extension, other people of color. And that's why Dr. King in his final book, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, memorably wrote that we made a grievous mistake in the way that we were thinking about access and opportunity in our struggle, because we spent so much time talking about having the right to do things that we forgot a simple truth. What good is it to have the right to eat in a restaurant if you can't afford anything on the menu? Civil rights without economic justice are dead rights. What good is it to have the right to go to school if you can't afford tuition? Civil rights without economic justice are dead rights. In fact, think about it this way. I share with you Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, very prominent African-American author in 1866, who's responding in that moment to conversation about the 15th Amendment and whether women will be given the right to vote. I'm going to share this with you because the person who she ultimately was responding to, although she wrote earlier, was Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who we lionize for, and we're celebrating this year the passage, or the anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920. When women did not get the right to vote through the 15th Amendment, Elizabeth Cady Stanton lashed out. But look at who she lashed out at. She wrote, American women of wealth, education, virtue, and refinement, if you do not wish the lower orders of Chinese, Africans, Germans, and Irish, with their low ideas of womanhood, to make laws for you and your daughters, to be your rulers, judges, jurors, to dictate not only the civil but moral codes by which you shall be governed, awake to the danger of your present position and demand that woman too shall be represented in this government. Time out. It wasn't the Chinese, Africans, Germans, and Irish that denied women the right to vote in that moment. It was the husbands, brothers, and sons of that privileged class of women of wealth, education, virtue, and refinement who were in power who denied them. Everybody follow me here? Look, I don't want to lose you, but 3 years earlier, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper called it, this woman of color. And I want you to think about what she says. She writes, "I do not believe that giving the woman the ballot is immediately going to cure all the ills of life. In the same way that you could translate to 2008 when people prematurely declared victory and saying, we elected Barack Obama and now we're post-racial. And very soon after, we found ourselves post-Trayvon Martin in the midst of a national Black Lives Matter movement, which has been running strong in this country since 2013. But she continues, I do not believe that white women are dewdrops just exhaled from the skies. I think that like men, they may be divided into three classes, the good, the bad, and the indifferent. I'm telling you, Frances is talking to us. She's talking to you. She's talking to me. I read this before the election, and it sat in my throat in a way, and I think you'll appreciate this when I get to what she shares. She says the good would vote according to their convictions and principles. The bad is dictated by prejudice or malice. And the indifferent will vote on the strongest side of the question with the winning party. She continues, you white women speak here of rights. I speak of wrongs. You're worried about getting the right to vote. I'm worried about what happens post-election when there's been no stimulus and we're talking about what may be unprecedented foreclosures and what will happen to people, particularly in communities like Minnesota, in the depth of winter when they are exposed and vulnerable. And that's what that election should have been a moratorium on. And again, not to be political, but I'm talking about 1866, not 2020. But if it echoes, we have to respect the reverberations. Follow the last part of this. She says, I, as a colored woman, have had in this country an education which has made me feel as if I were in a situation of Ishmael. My hand against every man, and every man's hand against me. Let me go tomorrow morning and take a seat in one of your streetcars. I do not know what they'll do in New York, but in Philadelphia, the conductor will put his hand and stop the car rather than let me ride. What was she talking about? Jim Crow treatment and African Americans being denied the right to ride on, this is 1866, by the way, not 1955 and Rosa Parks in Montgomery. So those wounds are deep and long. Let me conclude with you tonight by saying, and there's a lot of other great things that I could share with you, another very prominent African American woman, an educator, but I don't have time to deal with them. I want to end with Melba Patilla Beals because I began by talking about what happens when you don't address this for the next generation. Melba Patilla Beals was the youngest of Little Rock Nine. I just want to read to you from her diary, which she published as a book called Warriors Don't Cry. But she wrote this as she was going through the crisis in Little Rock. What she committed to her diary, which her mom told her to keep because she said, you know, your part of history right now, was this. How strange I thought to be involved in something the whole world considers among its 10 most important stories. If it's that important, you think somebody would do something to make the Central High students behave themselves. Is it that nobody cares or nobody knows what to do? I can almost hear the young people in our communities asking the same question. In fact, it's not that I can almost hear them. We saw them in Parkland. We saw them at the March for Our Lives. We saw them responding to the commentary about immigrants. And we saw them in the commentary about children in cages. We see the echoes of this in our contemporary moment. Last but not least, she says, by New Year's Eve, I only thought about Central High perhaps every other hour. So on New Year's Eve, 1958, I sat home completing my list of New Year's resolutions. I love this. Number one, to do my best to stay alive until May 29th. Why do we live in a nation where young people have to worry about how to stay alive? In 1956, 58, 57, 58, and in 2020. To pray daily for the strength not to fight back. The strain of faith that we read out of history is disturbing to me sometimes, because if you read history with a critical eye, you sometimes are exposed to how deeply faith impacted the people that we lionize as historical actors who took courageous stands. This young girl is praying every day, and look at the next one, reading Gandhi to understand how to behave. And what's compelling in all these things? To behave in a way that pleases mother and grandma, to maintain the best attitude I can at school, to help Grandma India with her work, to help Minnie Jean remain in school and to be a better friend to her. It is a catalog of Catholic social teaching. It is a catalog of shared humanity. It is a catalog of how to be creatively maladjusted. And we shouldn't have to think about what's happening in our contemporary moment and hear things like Black Lives Matter to remind us why that's important. I want to end with you with this slide tonight by saying, when we think about all this, John Lewis told us ordinary people with extraordinary vision can redeem the soul of America. We need to start thinking about how we can have that extraordinary vision. Historical recovery is one way to develop that, but the other way is to think about the ways in which we can develop that global perspective to help us think about how we move the needle. If we think about somebody like John Lewis, we have to understand that freedom is a constant struggle. He's born in 1940 in a world in which segregation is the norm. His singular achievement for many people was helping to get the Voting Rights Act passed of 1965. He dies in 2020 in the midst of a national Black Lives Matter movement. There's a way in which somebody could look at his life and say, that seems like a legacy of failure. He was born into a world in which there was segregation. He died in a world in which there's... But I think John Lewis would argue, and he said it, and I think we all need to think, this is a moment of opportunity and a moment of transformation. This is our second spring. And as John Lewis suggested, we have the power, if we commit ourselves in this moment to that transformation, to make it very different. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Williams. Very powerful, very informative. There's a number of questions that have come in with regard to what can we do. And so I'm going to ask a couple of these questions here. There's one on churches, which we'll get to in a minute, but I want to get to this from a very basic standpoint. There's a number of ones coming in here. From a very basic standpoint, if someone were to ask you, what can I as an individual do to make a difference when it comes to racism in our community, how would you reply?
I would, with Pedro Arrupe. And I didn't get a chance to get to this, but I want to share this with you. 1973, and Arrupe is somebody I love deeply. If we think about his timeline, born in 1907, lives through 2 world wars, writes in 1973 the works of justice and how we are men and women for others. That's the blueprint right there, a basic attitude of respect for all people, which forbids us to ever use them as instruments of our own profit. How do you manifest that? Because then the simple question is manifestation. So once we know what that is, it's simply a question of how do I live that every day? Like, what are the tangible things that I do every day in order to do that? Second one, which is the one that I struggle with, but I think it's the most powerful. A firm resolve never to profit from or allow ourselves to be suborned by positions of power deriving from privilege. Because the conversation we have is always about white privilege, but we all, in some sense, have some degree of privilege. It's not becoming so accustomed to that we forget that we need to bend that privilege to serve others, which is really powerful. And then the last one, I love this language too, to be drugged by the comforts of privilege is to become contributors to injustice as silent beneficiaries of the fruits of injustice. To drive by the George Floyd Memorial and go, glad that's over, not my problem, not my issue. And then last but not least, Father, an attitude not simply of refusal, but of counterattack, critical. See, it's so funny that so many people, and I love Ibram Kendi, don't get me wrong, but the reality is that this whole thing about take action has always been in the DNA of the Catholic response to injustice. Whether the church has been successful in fulfilling that, I think is problematic, because that's asking for a corporate response as opposed to what individual contributions people make to how they live that in their daily walk. And he concludes, and I'll conclude the answer this way, a decision to work with others. So it also begins with this idea that we have to engage, we have to make ourselves uncomfortable, we've got to get out and get to know people, toward the dismantling of unjust social structures so that the weak, the oppressed, the marginalized of this world may be set free. Arrupe, I think, beautifully nailed it.
And we can, I'll get a link, we can have Julie put that up on our website and on our socials as well. Arrupe's very powerful, very prophetic voice. with regard to, this is one of the first questions that came in, during the civil rights era, churches played an important role as the location where conversations about racism took place. Do you see churches in 2020 here in the Twin Cities having the capacity to play a similar role? And then what I would add to that is, and how are we going to get to that place of having those conversations in terms of moving from capacity to action?
I think what's happening here, this is unique. Of all the places that I've spoken in the last 5 or 6 months, this is the first church. And I think that says a lot. A lot of community organizations, a lot of corporations. It's not that the faith community is not engaged. I think that people aren't calibrated any longer to look toward faith leaders as the logical place to get comfort in times of anxiety or fear or angst. I almost admire the civil rights generation because it was baked into their DNA that the appropriate place that you dealt with those things first was in the house of the Lord, and then you went out. You had to get your head right in terms of how you were going to interact and engage with others before you went out and did that. And there was a narrative of social justice that undergirded that work that allowed for a philosophy of nonviolence that I don't see a lot of times now from either extreme. But particularly, you don't hear people talking about, because they don't have the language, we don't see the church membership and church attendance. We don't have that element of our society, which was a unifying theme and a unifying element, which we really have to talk about and find a way to, have that conversation in such a way that doesn't allow people to take the easy way out by talking about what the church hasn't done. It's not about what the church hasn't done. It's about what the church represents as a space for community healing and comfort and for growth, and about the lessons that can be learned in that space, because long before we talked about safe spaces, the church was a safe space. This is a place where people come together and can be vulnerable, where people seek solace and refuge, right? And honestly, Father, I think that's part of the challenge, is that we look every place but communities of faith. And then we'll have someone like Reverend Barber, who'll gain national attention, and we'll immediately move him out of the category of faith leader and into the category of civil rights leader. And I would think, and I've heard him say this many times, he's a faith leader first, because without faith, you can't have good works.
Right. So, not dwelling on what we haven't done in the Catholic community, because there is a lot there, and there's, of course, as we both are, big fans of Catholic social teaching, it's right there in the DNA of the church and in our way that we approach unjust social structures. But Black Catholics have noted across the ideological or the ecclesial spectrum an apathy among white Catholics with regard to racial injustice. Any thoughts, in terms of your, kind of viewing things from your perspective as to where, because as a faith leader, I want to try to figure out, how do we overcome that? Well, obviously, a program like tonight is a step in that direction, but how do we get people to open themselves up to reality and systemic racism when the data backs it up? I come at it as a lawyer, and if you were trying to prove up a case, you'd have both direct evidence, you'd have circumstantial evidence, and you'd have a winning case. But that phrase turns certain people just stop listening, including Catholics. Any thoughts on where some of that apathy might come from your perspective, and how we overcome it? It's that indifference piece from 1866, I think. My eyes are bad, so it was, 19th century, the quote that you put up.
And I think you're right. I think it is. I think Francis Ellen Watkins Harper, and I saw it often at University of Scranton with really wonderful, moral, ethical people that I went to school with who read the same text that I did, but never felt compelled to compare them or use them in the same way because they weren't relevant in the way that, I love Father Massengill, Brian Massengill. I think he's brilliant. I read him because he speaks to me in terms of my experience through the filter of faith. And in language that I'm familiar with and in text that I'm familiar with, but they're also kind of anchored intimately in my experience. My challenge in other moments in my life was no sense of immediacy for people who had that level of comfort that Arupe talked about in point number 2. A level of comfort until I was in my 30s, I didn't experience. So the privilege of a PhD and the opportunity to have a great job and a big title anesthetizes you to the reality of what many people are experiencing, and it can drug you in a way that he talked about. I think that the challenge for all of us is to get back in those texts, those foundational texts, and to really interrogate what they mean and translate them for this generation in this moment. You know, because we talk about it. That's part and parcel of what we're doing with historical recovery, is just trying to give people a space to go, if we adjust this light a little bit and we shine it on us, what's it saying about us if we're not change agents in this moment? Because, God forbid, 100 years from now, somebody might be up standing in another structure like this, reading a quote from one of us on the wrong side of these issues. And we want to be on the right side of these issues in terms of how we think about. And you know this, Father, the texts are so important to me because I do think they illuminate how people of faith in those moments were also grappling with the same issues and came out with very similar responses. We simply need to apply and then keep the pressure on.
Yeah, I agree with you. And, the cultural forces that lead to people being anesthetized are so important. The positive dimension of what we're going through right now, the silver lining is, both in terms of the killing of George Floyd and the aftermath, but also COVID, is that it can shake us from our anesthetized reality. Pope Francis, in The Joy of the Gospel, right in the beginning, which Hunter Johnson's father, Tom Johnson, quoted when he received an award at Hennepin County, basically the feverish pursuit of materialism, and then the kind of lack of God, lack of faith, but also the lack of real compassion and solidarity. All of those things contribute, whereas a time like this, this is the moment, and I think it can wake us up in a way that we see reality more clearly. I just want to ask a couple more questions here, and we'll just go just a few minutes over, but it's great to have Dr. Williams here sharing his wisdom and perspective. Let's see here. Give me 1 second. This is kind of another what we can do. What are the steps that we should be taking as a Catholic community? So we have a lot of people on live stream and folks viewing from other communities as well. But most of the audience is Catholic. What are steps we can be taking as a Catholic community and as individuals to begin tearing down the barriers that prop up systemic racism?
It's something we talk about as well. I think we all have, I'm going to kind of frame this in 2 ways. There's the approach where people assume that you target the issue that created this, so everybody needs to be concerned about and involved with police brutality. We all have expertise, spiritual gifts, training in areas that are touched by other manifestations of what I like to call the 6 degrees of segregation, be it housing, education, lack of access to places of public accommodation, Jim Crow justice. Think about what you could contribute to those conversations and then involve yourself in tangible ways that let you privilege those gifts in a way that could have real meaning for people and or communities that are struggling. Good example, I'm on the board of the YWCA. They need IT support. So if you've got IT background and IT training and you're saying, I've got all this computer expertise and it'd be great, why not go out and find an organization that's dealing with poverty or interventions on poverty to say, hey, is there something I can do to help your organization be more efficient at its work? And in this small way, I'm making a contribution. I think sometimes we're also, particularly young people, driven by this notion that, and Thurgood Marshall said it best in the aftermath of Brown versus Board of Education. He said, we thought with this case it was all going to be over. And that can't be our mentality. The one thing I take from Al Sharpton is, 400 years to build this, we're not going to dismantle it in 4 months. So we really have to start asking about a deeper commitment toward the things we can do, and then the things that you love doing that you're going to do anyway, that you then can say, this is something I have a passion for, so let me give back through something that gives me joy. But also be uncomfortable in the space that, recognizing that I may have to be a little bit out of my comfort zone in order to do this in a space that I'm not comfortable with. But there's some real value that can be derived by engaging with people through these activities. And I think that's critical, is just the small ways. Incremental change has always been a driver of transformation in our society and culture. And if more people were making those small changes, we'd already be a very different society.
Right. So our colleague, Amy Levad from the theology department, talks about restorative justice leading to transformative justice. And as you know, this is some of the work that I've been doing in terms of restorative justice. How do you see a connection between the work of restorative justice and building a more just, inclusive society, and the work of racial justice, building a more racially just society? How do you see those two connected?
Intimately intertwined. I don't think you can decouple them. I use Malcolm X a lot, but I tell educators a story about how different Malcolm's life would have been if restorative justice practices had been practiced in Lansing, Michigan. And if in those moments where he was kind of falling into truancy, someone had looked at that situation differently and said, oh, he's acting out because of X, Y, Z, rather than saying the way to deal with this is to break up his family, declare him a truant. And, we can literally see in Malcolm's story, Malcolm liked to speak. This is the other thing about the question of faith. We sometimes forget that even Malcolm X was a minister, the Nation of Islam. So faith is, a big part of this. But Malcolm often told his story in parables. And he would also frame white supremacy in the ways that it had impacted his family. And in nearly every one of those stories, the moment of change or transformation could have been through an effort at restorative justice, whether it was what happened in, the petty theft that he was involved in Roxbury, which could have been dismissed, and maybe he could have been rehabilitated in that moment. His encounters with the educational system, his encounters with the criminal justice system, it's almost a blueprint for why we need to think about how that then impacts the way that people show up and the narratives they have about why they don't want to participate or how they feel about a larger society and culture. So I think they're intimately related. You can't decouple them.
For me, it was a quarter century ago in law school, and it was African-American friends listening to their experiences, very different than my own, and black law students over the last 7 or 8 years, just hearing their stories and the common elements and the pain and the trauma. It can be transformative, and then, as you note, in school, restorative practices are very important. I'm going to just end with this question. We asked it of our panel last week, and they had some interesting answers and some common themes. Given the significant disparities in Minnesota, racial disparities across multiple categories, some the most acute in the nation that you referenced in your talk, in terms of educational outcomes. I always want to, whether it's harm that ecclesial culture can produce, or American culture, or a particular state culture, I want to get to that cultural question. Where do you think, what are some of the things that you see? You didn't grow up here in Minnesota, but you've been here for a number of years, came back here to St. Thomas, which we all are thankful for. Because this is ground zero in many ways, and there's an opportunity here. But where do you see Minnesota culture contributing to some of those most acute disparities with regard to racial justice? Anything you can put your finger on?
I think two things that are, and I thought a lot about this. There was no sense of immediacy around these issues I felt before the murder of George Floyd. In fact, part of the reason I was anxious to go back to the East Coast is whether you felt like people were moving the needle or not, there was that sense of urgency around these critical conversations. And not the Minnesota nice way of never knowing where you stand with people with regard to how they're feeling about those issues and whether they're willing to have those types of conversations. It's a very closed society, and it's hard to get a sense of where people stand. Shortly after Mr. Floyd's killing, the emails and phone calls I was getting from people who I had what I thought were transactional or superficial relationships with, where I had been saying to them, wouldn't it be great if we could do this? And then politely they say, yeah, it would be great, and you never hear from them again, were then suddenly showing back up and saying, you know, something about this moment, as you mentioned at the very beginning, has awakened me, and I understand that. But the third piece of that is, and we have to be generous to everybody in this, is that sense of immediacy came from that comfort. COVID-19, you said it in the beginning, Father, I think this is very important. This was a unique moment for us because it wasn't simply the fact that we got that 9 minutes of video relative to, because that's not the first time we've captured egregious behavior that way. It was the fact that COVID-19 had us all home for a sufficient amount of time at that point that we were transfixed and watching COVID numbers go up, and then we all had to watch that together. And I think in a very tangible way, it's the first time in a long time. You'd have to go back in our history, maybe the Challenger explosion, maybe the moon landing, where so many people at one time witnessed something. But in the case of George Floyd, it was this traumatic manifestation of what people have been talking about, and you couldn't escape it. There was no way that you could turn the TV off and walk away. And in the case of Minnesota, I think part of the urgency came around the fact that it was here. So it wasn't like, you know, we were watching what was happening in fact, I like to tell people, after Ahmaud Arbery was killed, they asked people to go out and do a 2.5-mile run. And so I went up to Fort Snelling to do my run. And I'll never forget this, having this eerie feeling of looking at the placard of the two indigenous leaders that were executed there by the US government during the Dakota War, and feeling in that moment the pain of indigenous people who for years since I've come here have said, you don't understand how we feel about Fort Snelling and what it represents. And then I'm at Fort Snelling doing a run for Ahmaud Arbery, and I have the sensitivity in that moment. I feel like the nation went through that a little bit with George Floyd, and they weren't able to recalibrate and go back. And the second part of it is now, what I loved hearing from people, particularly President Julie Sullivan, who has always been a huge supporter of mine, but who I think is one of the most thoughtful and sensitive leaders and visionary leaders that I've ever had an opportunity to work with. She said, you know, you can go back east and I'm sure you'll be successful and you'll bring those skills there, but you also spent the last 3 years telling people they need to invest where that need is the greatest. And she said, the need here is the greatest, not because there aren't caring people who are committed, but because there's this work of educating that needs to be done, and it has to be done through the lens that I know we share, Father, which is through empathy and human compassion and shared humanity. And if that falls off the radar, we will fail. I don't think we will. I think we can deliver on the Minnesota that, you know, Governor Wendell was on the cover of Time magazine for in 1973, but it will look more like a multicultural, you know, Leslie Redmond this summer described Minnesota as the white Wakanda, and that kind of, you know, caught fire on social media. But I'd love it if in, you know, 4 years, 5 years, we all came back and sat down with Leslie and other leaders who were part of this moment, and we were all talking about how Minnesota became the Wakanda for everyone.
That's terrific, and I'm reminded of what happened in our archdiocese. We went from charged by Ramsey County, bankrupt, in a very, very challenging place, to becoming a national leader in a lot of areas. And it comes out of that, the ashes. And I think the harm was acute, no doubt, first and foremost for victims of clergy abuse, but the opportunity to build something out of the ashes, which is where God does great work when we're out of answers, can really be a profound opportunity. I thank you for your generosity of spirit. I share this with our colleagues at St. Thomas and members of our community, that we're so grateful that you did come back to the Twin Cities community. I think there's great work to be done. It's pressing work. You have the pledge of Our Lady of Lourdes to support that work, and our colleagues who are both here and at St. Thomas, like Hank Shea and others. And So thank you again, and please keep us in your prayers as we discern how we can be a voice, not only a voice for justice, but to roll up our sleeves and help build a more just and inclusive Minnesota. So thanks again, Dr. Williams.
Thanks, Father.
And we pledge our support for your work. And the people at home are clapping as well. So join us for future sessions, St. Anthony's sessions going forward. And Julie will get this program out as well, and we'll get some of the sources and resources out there as well that Dr. Williams referenced. And thank you again, and remember that God loves you. Never forget that.